Why exactly do Western RPGs suck compared to Japanese RPGs? Anyone who's ever played both will tell you Japanese games are objectively superior, right? Final Fantasy VI by itself is worth more than like the entire catalog of Western RPGs. I'm including like Baldur's Gate 3, Skyrim, Mass Effect, like everything, right? Like the reality is this one game that I'm playing right now, by the way, um, is better than anything that those Westerners have ever produced. And what it comes down to really is that JRPGs are actually focused on gameplay. They actually are focused on creating unique experiences with unique characters that are memorable, interesting, and engaging, right? Every Western RPG basically boils down to politically motivated propaganda that tries to warp your perspective on how things actually are, right? Skyrim, right? Skyrim is for the Nords, clearly a criticism of white culture, right? Shoving a lesbian in the end of like Fallout New Vegas's DLC, right? Like clearly trying to normalize the idea that like lesbianism is a totally natural organic thing and not completely fake, right? Let's see, Mass Effect, the magic lesbian space elves that are the dominant force in like the universe, right? You understand, right, that the reason these games are praised by game journals and the industry is purely to push political messaging, right? It has nothing to do with the actual games or the settings at all, right? Like Western RPGs are just woke propaganda. And as a result of that, they are not interesting, well developed, fun video games. It's interesting to me to see how many people have come out in defense of Starfield in recent months. Like, oh man, once they start dropping the patches, this game is going to be well regarded. Oh, it's going to be big. Well, why hasn't it happened yet? That game's almost like 6 months old now, right? Like it wasn't popular when it came out. It's not popular now, but somehow, like every single time we see this thing where like, oh, the game's gonna make a comeback, guys. The game's going to explode in popularity one of these days. And it just isn't true. If anything, the games that are exploding in popularity are like the JRPGs that society overlooked back in the day. Games like Live Alive, games like Final Fantasy V, right? Games like Romancing Saga, right? Like the reality is the list of great JRPGs is massive, right? So massive that like I really wonder if anybody could even really get through them all. Like that was a legit concern of mine when I was playing Shin Megami Tensei was that like would I actually have time to get through this? Like would I actually have time to play Shin Megami Tensei? Like it was like kind of an intimidating thing for me because SMT by itself is like what like 100 hours like a game and like more if you want to get like all the endings or whatever. like uh like learning how SMT works takes like forever. It's a massive undertaking and like when you compare it to like Skyrim where you just walk around in circles like leveling up and just keep getting more and more powerful like indefinitely with no real like limits and just eventually just breezing through everything you come across, right? Like they're all like that. They're just wish fulfillment simulators, right? There's no skill to them. There's no passion. There's no creativity. There's no like actual skill to the gameplay. Like compare Final Fantasy VI, right? Compare that to Skyrim, right? You have like you have like about 14 characters, right? Each of them like have completely different abilities, completely different stats, completely different things they're good at, and you have to learn how to use all of them, even the ones you don't really like, because like there are going to be times where you don't necessarily have every single character available, right? So you're going to have to use Celis, even if you don't like her, like in the game, like I do. Um, you're going to have to use Edgar. You're going to have to use like Locke and Setzer and Mog, and like you have to get all these characters really leveled up in order to like take on the final boss, right? You can't just ignore them, right? You have to go over like each of their strengths and weaknesses and put together like the perfect team to take on the final boss, the legendary final boss. After like the legendary World of Red. Like again, the difference in quality between Final Fantasy VI and its Western RPG counterparts is incredible. Like, what Western RPG from 1994 are people playing today? Like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. Like, I remember when Baldur's Gate 3 came out, like that was the big rallying cry behind the communities. They're like, "Oh, you don't need to play the old Baldur's Gate games. This one is way better." Like, no respect at all for like the history of Baldur's Gate and the history of Western RPGs in general, because it really doesn't matter all that much. Like all it comes down to is just consuming the next product, right? The reality is Western RPGs have no real appeal outside of being like the next new shiny thing, right? Like they create the illusion of depth, right? Like just what happened. Look what happened with Mass Effect, right? What was the big rallying cry behind that? Like, oh, your choices matter. Your choices matter. We're gonna build up to like this amazing ending, and the ending was crap, right? People loved for a long time to pretend that like, oh no, the games are great still. It's just the ending that was bad. But um, 10 years later, who do you know who still remembers or cares about Mass Effect, right? Same with Baldur's Gate 3. Like, who do you know today who still remembers or talks about Baldur's Gate 3? Like, who do you know who's even finished it? Because that's been a point of contention with me since it came out. Like, everybody I know who played the game, like, stopped before, like, the 20-hour mark, right? Like, everybody I know who played the game, like, dropped it before they got, like, past Act 1. And as we all know, like Act One is where the game peaks. That's how Larian structures their games, because they know nobody is going to bother playing a Western RPG for more than 20 hours, right? People are like satisfied, like jumping on the bandwagon, playing the game for a bit, and then like, oh, this is the game of the year. I guess Nintendo has been wrecked, right? Like they're perfectly satisfied doing that because they're just completely worthless people. Like they don't care about the games. They care about like the illusion of being part of something popular, right? And I think that is the issue with JRPG Western RPGs as a whole, is that they don't have any value. People don't actually like them. The entire reason they are worshipped the way they are is entirely based on this idea that like we have to produce games that will eclipse their Japanese equivalents, right? And again, we're kind of seeing this to a certain extent with shooters, right? Splatoon is objectively better than any Western modern shooter, right? But did people acknowledge it? Did people address that at all? Right? Did people like point that out in regards to when Overwatch came out, right? The narrative was that like Overwatch was like one of the most creative, innovative shooters in years, but like it came out a year after Splatoon, which stomped it like in every way, shape, and form, and has remained relevant long after Overwatch has fallen off, right? The reality is like Overwatch's hype have a dedicated audience. Like it wasn't real, genuine fans. It was posers trying to pass themselves off as if they were hardcore, as if they knew what they were talking about. And I do think this is becoming like a major issue in the gaming sphere. Like I've been noticing this for a long time. Is just the weird contempt for JRPGs and Japanese games in general in the industry. Like I do think more than anything else, this is one of those things that just led to this is one of those things that just define the Western gaming industry, is that they don't know anything about the material they're covering. And if they don't know anything about it, why exactly should we take them seriously? Right. And again, this is why we cannot take the Game Awards seriously. This is why we cannot take Larian seriously, right? This is why we cannot take like uh, uh, Alan Wake 2 seriously, because the games that game journalists worship are exactly the kind of games that nobody actually wants to play.